Hey everybody. So I'm here in my studio and I wanted to record this intro to watercolors because thought maybe it'd be a good idea for you guys to either be able to access before the actual Zoom meeting and refer to it after. I wanted to just give you a little preview. I am not an art teacher. I never went to art school. I went to social work school, but my mother was an artist. My sister was an artist. My brother was an artist. So it's kind of innate in me. And I've always loved watercolor. So the beauty of a watercolor is that the paint is transparent as opposed to any other medium like oils or acrylics or even pastels. And what that means is when you put down a transparent watercolor on a piece of paper and it dries, and then you take another color and you put it over it, you can always see the translucence underneath. So it shows through and it gives water. That's the beauty of watercolor. That's what makes it different and special from any other medium. And that's what I love about it. So what I have here is the supply list that I gave you. I have my watercolors, and as I said, I use tubes, but I recommended that you just start with pans, which is fine. And what I do is I mark my watercolors so I know what colors they are, but I've been using the same palette for so long, I know what colors they are. But this is pretty much what I work with. I also have my box of Crayola crayons, no, my box of tubes, my watercolor tubes. I have my watercolor brushes, which, I recommended you just get a really basic set to start with. I have 2 cups of clean water, and I just use these little, one's plastic from the top of a dish detergent for laundry detergent. That's what it is. Laundry detergent bottle. And this is just a little glass bottle. And these work just fine. One's clean water, which you always wash your brush in, and the other one is for grabbing the water. So I also have my masking tape. I have a cloth to wipe my brushes. I have plenty of paper towel. I have my salt, and this is just Himalayan pink salt, but it's coarse, and we're going to do something fun with that. And I also have my great value premium plastic wrap. We're going to do something really fun with that. So I'm going to try to just give you a basic understanding of how to start working with watercolor. What I've done is I have taped my paper onto a board. And I've just sectioned it off in 6 places because I'm going to show you hopefully 6 different little techniques that you can then use going forward to try whatever it is that you want to do with watercolors on your own. So I'm going to start with the basics, the real basics, which is how to load your brush with your watercolor. So I'm going to move this out of the way. Let me just put it. I'm going to show you. I'm going to take one of my waters and my watercolors, and I'm going to use one of the bigger brushes. And you always want your watercolors to be wet. So I'm just going to dip my brush, and I'm just going to, it doesn't matter what colors I use, I'm going around my palette and I'm adding water because the paint dries very hard. And if you're using your brand new watercolors, then you need to wet them because they won't work. So I'm just going around, dipping some water in. And if you want, you don't have to do them all. You can just do whatever colors you want to work with. But It's never a bad idea to give them a little. And you can see the water gets pretty dirty right off. And then I just wipe it off like this. Okay, so these paints are basically ready to use. Put this back over here. Move this over. So my palette's going to be right over here. My water's going to be here. And my brush is here. And I'm going to bring this back up. Okay. So what I'm going to start with is a basic wash. And at the end, I'm planning that everything that we do here together, you will be able to use and do a painting with it. All these techniques you can use to do a really easy but fun painting, which I'll show you how to do that. So I'm going to start off with a basic wash. And for that, you need your biggest brush. Other than my really big brush, this is a flat wash, 1.5 inches. I use this if I'm going to wet the whole paper down with water, but I'm only going to wet squares. So I think this will work. This is a 12, size 12. So we're going to start with that. And I'm going to use my clean water. Always use clean water for washes. And I'm just going to wet the paper. And I'm going to bring it down so you can see. So I'm using my clean water. And I'm wetting the paper. It doesn't really matter what direction you go. You can go up and down. And you can tell when the paper's wet. There, that's enough. And if you hold it at an angle, you can see that paper's wet. And then what you want to do is pick a color. I'm going to use my cobalt blue. I'm going to get some on my brush, twirl my brush in the paint, put it on the palette, and just really, this is called loading the brush. So I'm taking some paint from the little area it's in, and I'm putting it on my palette, and then I'm loading my brush. It's got lots of paint in it. When my paper is still wet, you can tell it's wet because it has that sheen on it. And I'm going to start at the top, and I'm just going to draw a line, and then another line, and another line. And then you can go back in, get a little more water, load your brush again, and just kind of keep going down. Straight lines all the way across. And you'll see that the paint is moving, which is lovely. That's what you want. And you just cover that whole area. And watercolor moves, which is really fun. It's one of the beauties of it. You can pick this up and you can see that is moving. So you can kind of guide the paint and pick it up this way and let it come down this way. So what we have is this beautiful patch of blue, and it's a wash because it's even color all the way down. Now, I'm going to show you something fun. If you want to turn this little wash into a sky with clouds. All you have to do is take a piece of tissue or paper towel, kind of crinkle it up a little like this, and just kind of twirl it, and then dip it down, push, and lift. And you've got yourself a beautiful cloud. I'm going to do it again here, and lift. And this lifting technique is a technique that you can also use if you're painting something, you don't like it, you can re-wet the area you're working on and then just lift it with a paper towel. So this is always a great tool to have. So there you go. That is technique number one, a wash, a beautiful wash with lifted paint, and it makes that clouds. Okay, so there's one, easy enough, and you can play with that and do it over and over. I can't tell you how many washes I've played with over and over again. If you want to get a nice clean wash, you just gotta, sometimes it dries funky and you have to, say, okay, well, that didn't work out very well, so I'm going to try this again. Watercolor takes a lot of practice. I've been painting with watercolor for, I would say, 12 years now. So this comes naturally to me, but in the beginning I was frustrated with it. So because it's a difficult medium to work with, but it's so rewarding and it's so much fun. So I am going to pause this for 1 second and get ready for the next one. I wanted to show you some examples of places in paintings where I've used this technique of the wash and then lifted to make clouds. So here's a pigeon on a bench. That's exactly what I did. I did a light wash of blue, and then I used my paper towel and I lifted, and I got these lovely clouds in the background. Here is another painting where I did a wash, same thing. I didn't lift as much, but this was pretty much a one solid wash where I tried to keep the paint as consistent as I could. And I did the painting first and went around it. This is another wash where it's very uniform, but you can see the places where it's white, where I didn't lift in this instance, but it just dried that way. So washes can do a lot of things, and you can do a lot with them. They're an essential skill when you're painting with watercolor. Okay, so next we're going to do what's called wet on wet. And this is when the paper's wet and also the paint's wet. So it's similar to what we did with the wash, but instead of going back and forth, we're going to try this with a circle. So I am going to, I'm just going to use the inside of my masking tape roll. And I'm gonna, here's my pencil. I've only got 1 million of them. So I'm just gonna take this. I'm just gonna take my pencil and I'm just gonna draw a circle. And then I'm gonna do one over here too, because we're gonna do a similar technique using a circle. So you can go ahead and draw 2 circles. Okay. So I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna take my brush. To wet it, I'm gonna stick with this number 12. I clean water. And I am just going to very gently go around. I'm not going to go to the edge of the circle. I'm going to let my water stay just a little bit away from it, just a smidge. Really, no, that's not going to work. I thought maybe more light, you can see it better. But I think you can see. I'm just very gently coming to the edge, to near the edge, and you can see where it's dry because the paper's not wet. Yeah, that sounds silly. You can see where it's dry because the paper's not wet. But that is true. So if you look at it, you can see there's this glossy area. That's how you always can tell that your paper is dry. So I'm going to go in, wet my brush, and I'm going to use some purple in this one. Just load my brush. Now you can see this is my dirty water. So this is going to get dirty very quickly. Okay, so I'm loading my brush so I get a nice point, kind of twirling it in the paint. In fact, I'm going to do a switcheroo here. I'm not going to use this number 12. So I'm going to just clean that out. Wipe it down. Put it over here. I'm going to downsize to a number 8. Because I want to really be able to get in there. That's it's still wet. I can still see the difference between the wet paper and the dry paper in my circle. So I'm loading my brush. And now I'm going to very gently just come around. Now my brush is wet and it's full. And then I'm going to bring it right to the edge. But it won't bleed over because there's no water there. And you can see how it's starting to move already. Take this very slowly. And you can tell, I'm gonna reload this. Dip it in the water, reload it back. Here. You can tell when the brush doesn't have any more paint in it and it needs to be reloaded. That's kind of an intuitive thing that happens when you've been painting a while. That's where the practice comes in. So I can tell right now that my brush needs more paint. Coming over to the edge. And I'm just going to move towards where I started. Come back and cover that in. And this is wet on wet. Now as that dries, it's going to dry a little bit lighter. Watercolor always dries lighter. So you can go back in and do a second coat if you want. If you see areas where you missed and you want to get closer to the edge, once it's dry, you can go back in. That is the wet on wet technique. Wet brush, wet paper. So I'm going to do this same thing. Actually, no. You know what I'm going to do? For fun, I'm going to add another color to this. So this is still wet enough. There's a lot of moisture on that paper. I'm going to add some red. Just over here to one side. So that you can see what, look at that. Look at that beautiful paint. How it's just moving. You know your paper's wet when the watercolor moves. And I want this to kind of blend. I want the two colors to have kind of a seamless blending. So I've got this kind of half moon, and then my brush is wet. There's actually nothing on it really. I cleaned it, dab it a little bit, and then I'm just gonna kind of tease the paint, the red paint over very gently. I'm just kind of nudging it so that it's got a much more seamless blend from the red to the purple. Isn't that pretty? Okay. So that is the wet on wet technique with 2 blended colors. And that will dry, and it will dry lighter, as I said. So I'm going to do the same thing over here, but this one is going to be wet on dry. So my paintbrush is going to be wet with paint, but my paper's going to stay dry. I'm not going to wet this first. So I'm going to use the same color. I'm going to go in with my purple, and my paper is dry, and you'll feel the difference. I'm going to take my time, go right up to the edge. I'm kind of moving my paintbrush in the round direction. And you can see here it's dragging, so I know I need more paint. Because the paper's not wet, so there's nothing to really help it. So I reload my brush with my watercolor paint, and I go back in. It's nice. Make sure we got a lot of paint on there. I'm going to come around. And you're going to find your own style as you paint and practice. And even if you're practicing these techniques over and over again with different colors, it will serve you well. Practice is so important with watercolor. Okay, so you can already see, because there wasn't paint down to begin with, it's drying really quickly. The side is already dry. But I'm going to work with it, and I'm going to go in with the red. Same thing, load my brush with red. I'm going to come on this side, and I'm just going to come around my circle. Make that moon shape. And we've got the red blending into the purple. And you can see on this one, on the wet on wet, it kept moving. It keeps moving. And that's okay. That's beautiful. That's watercolor. Watercolor kind of has a mind of its own sometimes. You can't control watercolor. You can experiment with all the techniques of watercolor and practice and practice and practice, but you really never have the control. Even me, after all this time, I struggle with some paintings, and I just have to kind of say, okay, this isn't perfect, but the process of painting was wonderful, and I'm gonna keep going with it, and it's gonna be the best painting that I can do at this particular time. But I've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of paintings, and many of them are failures, but they were all learning experiences. So nothing lost there. Okay, so now we have practiced a wash, lifting paint to make clouds, wet on wet, wet on dry. That's 4 actually techniques. Watercolor takes basic techniques. So this next one I want to show you is a lot of fun, and I'm going to show you where I've used it. we're going to use our salt, our Himalayan salt. Texture is something that can be difficult to achieve in watercolor. So we use the tools that we have to create texture. I have taught myself how to achieve texture without a lot of these extra techniques, but I've also loved using them and continue and will always use them in certain paintings. So I'm going to show you one of my favorite paintings that I've used salt in, and you'll see how cool it is. So this beautiful little fox in the woods, I call him Winter Fox, and this background that I used to kind of create the illusion of maybe snow or ice or winter, that is salt. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to wet one of our squares. We're going to just cover it up with paint, watercolor paint. I'm going to use my number 12 brush for this. And let me maybe down so that I can show you. I'm just going to go in this square. I'm going to do the blue again. I use blue a lot. It's one of my favorite colors. And I am just going to cover this whole square with blue. And you want a good amount for this technique. You really need a good amount of paint on there. It doesn't matter how you put it down, you just put it down. You don't want it to dry though, so kind of the faster you go, the better. I'm gonna mix a little darker paint, a darker blue. This is actually Payne's Gray, but it's got a beautiful bluish tint to it. So I want a lot of paint on there, and I was running out of my cobalt, so I'm actually just gonna use the Payne's Gray and cover my square. Okay, you see how wet that is? There's a lot of paint on there. You can add more, you can just dab it on. You want to make sure it's wet. Okay, a lot of paint. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to get my salt shaker. Now, coarse salt makes, I'm going to sprinkle. Coarse salt makes big, oh my goodness, and you can see it happening. It like soaks the paint up. The salt just soaks the paint. You want to keep it in the square. Okay, that's that. And that has to dry. And that, I would say that needs to dry until for several hours, maybe even tomorrow, you know, maybe even like 8 hours. And when you're done with that, you really just, you brush off the paint. And this is what you're going to have. It's going to be so cool. See, there's no salt on there. That's all been brushed off. So when this was done, and I let that dry, and I knew it was dry, I just took my hand and I just brushed the salt off into the trash, and then I was left with these beautiful marks. And they'll always be there. Okay, so that's the salt technique for texture. All right, I'm gonna move on to our saran wrap, but I do want to make sure I don't have any salt on that bottom square. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to soak up the square with a lot of paint. And I'm going to turn my board around here so that that part is closer to my screen where you can see it. Okay, So I'm going to do that over here. And I think I'm going to use, let's see, we're doing saran wrap. I'm going to use burnt sienna. And you don't have to use one color. I mean, actually, yeah, let's do that with this. Let's just pick a few colors. We're just gonna cover our square. So to see how cool the technique can be, you can do it with several colors. Now, color theory is a whole different thing, which I can't get into in this short a time. But I also really have just learned it because I didn't go to art school. Color theory is something that I couldn't possibly begin to talk about, but I kind of instinctively know it. And when I don't know it, I use a color wheel. I have a little plastic paper color wheel that tells me what colors work well together, what are complementary colors. So I from practice, I know what colors work well. So I know that burnt sienna has red in it. I know if I were to add a green on top of this, I'm gonna get like a very dark brown, which I don't really want. Red and blue, however, make purple. If we go back to our primary colors, so blue is a color that you could mix with the red sienna, and I'm just gonna drop it in here, like in the corners, just for interest, just so you can see I've got a lot of paint on here. And then just for fun, because that's what this is all about, I'm gonna draw a line down the center with my brush. Okay, so I have a square with two colors. I'm gonna take my saran wrap, get myself a piece. And I'm gonna sprinkle it up. And then I'm gonna open it. And I am just going to lay this down on top of my little square. And you can see what's happening already. You see how it's grabbing? I'm gonna press down and I'm just gonna move it. Not too much, but just enough. You can kind of see what's happening here. Okay. So you can see what that looks like. You can see that where it's pressed down and where the saran wrap is lifted up. You've got some very interesting textures going on there. And that, again, is going to need to dry, I'd say a day. And I'm going to show you what that is going to look like. So I've used that technique in a lot of paintings. I used it in this one with the feathers. And I actually used the same colors, a little bit darker on the one we just did, but this is a lighter version of burnt sienna and my blue. And look at what it did. All the places where the saran wrap lifts, you can see it happening here, where it's lifted up, it's going to leave those white lines. And this, to me, I did the whole piece of paper with this piece before I put the feathers on, and it looked like wind. There was so much movement happening that feathers seemed like the natural thing to add to this painting. So that's what you can get with saran wrap. So that needs to dry. Our salt needs to dry. And so I would just say, let's put this aside until tomorrow, and we'll come back and we'll see what it looks like. tomorrow's going to be in about 2 seconds. So, but I am going to shut down for now, and I'll see you in a minute when everything's dry. Okay, so I am back. I know I said it was going to be a day, and sometimes I do let my saran wrap and my salt like sit overnight if I've finished something before I went to bed. But this is actually only a few hours later. So you can see, you can tell when you do yours when it's dry. Like you can touch it. The salt is totally stuck to the paint. You can tell it'll be easy to flick off. And the saran wrap, you can tell when that's dry too, because it kind of lifts itself off. So I am going to show you. I'm just going to lift this off. Like, and there are these beautiful, beautiful textures. You can see that. There's so many things that you can do with that, and I'll show you that. And then now I'm going to get rid of this salt, and I'm just going to brush it onto this board, and then I'll put it in my trash. So all I'm going to do is kind of gently, and you can use your hand or you can use a paper towel, it doesn't matter. You can do this right into the trash. Oh, this stuff over. But, and it's sticky. I mean, it's stuck on there, but look at these textures. So rough this up a little bit, my fingers, so all the salt is off. And there, I really can't, it's smooth, totally smooth. I really can't feel anything else on there. The salt's gone, and look at that. Beautiful, beautiful texture, which you can use in so many different kinds of paintings. So I'm gonna put this aside, and we're gonna do one more technique together. Get my salt and put it in my trash. Clean up my hair here a little bit. Salt everywhere. Okay, so we have one more square. And what we're going to do with this is a technique called, two little techniques. One's we're going to drop some paint in. It will be wet on wet. And then we will do some splattering, which is fun. You might be wondering why and when you use wet on wet versus wet on dry. For some artists, it's a preference. When you paint wet on wet, you get a much smoother transition of paint. It's a softer, looser kind of a painting. When you paint wet on dry, you have a little more control over what's happening on the paper. I am a very detailed painter. I like realism, so I tend to paint more wet on dry because I feel like it allows me to have more control with the paint. And I paint with really tiny brushes most of the time. But the wet on wet technique is very useful, as I've shown you, for washes. It's also very useful if you want to paint loosely and free flowing, which is a beautiful, I mean, that's the beauty of watercolor. A lot of painters who paint big flowers, petals, leaves, that's a technique that wet on wet works very nicely with. So that's kind of the difference. So this technique that we're going to do is we're going to wet our square, the last one. And I am going to, again, I'm going to use my big 12 brush, use my clean water. And I'm just going to wet this square. I'm not being fussy about it. I'm just making sure that there's water on there. Tilting it just so that I can see the sheen and know that it's all wet. Okay. And then I'm just going to pick some colors. I am going to use my kind of burnt sienna. And I'm just going to drop it in, and look at what you get. This is watercolor at its finest. The water just takes it. And the more you tilt the paper, the more it's going to run. Which you can control that. If you keep it flat, it's not going to run as much. But if you want it to run, just add some more colors in here, just so that you can kind of see. So the lovely effects that you get. I'm just going to kind of keep. Put some green over here. This is just called dropping in paint. I'm just loading my brush like I showed you. I'm just kind of dotting and letting it go where it wants. Letting it go. And you could just absolutely make beautiful abstract designs with this. You could use it to do flower petals. You could use it to make pretty much anything that you see. I use this technique a lot in combining it with my ink pens. I will make some designs on a paper, I'll let it dry, and then I'll just go in and I'll make my designs like I did on the hands for the balance lesson on YouTube. I did it for my mandala. A lot of my mandalas had color, wet, just runs of color. And look at that. Okay. So we've got that. And now I'm going to show you something else, which is a very interesting technique and useful in a lot of ways. I use it a lot. What if you don't have this type of brush? This is a square head brush. I think in the suggestion for brushes, it would have had this, but if it doesn't, if you don't have one, you can use a round brush. You can use any brush, but the square-headed brush works the best. And I have a very old one that I like to use for this technique. I've had this brush for years. It's just a 3/8 wash brush, but it's really beaten because I've used it so much. So this works well for this technique. And what we're going to do is we're just going to wet our brush, pick a color. Let's see. Okay. I'm going to do some of that Payne's gray over this. Load the brush. And then we're going to flick paint. So what you do is, what I do, this is my technique, I flick with my pointer finger, I hold the brush, and I just flick paint. You can cover up your area. this is, we're already covered with our masking tape, but all right. Well, you can see that makes a very cool design. So there you go. We have 6 different techniques. And what we're going to do with this is use some of these techniques to actually make a painting. But I did want to show you one thing that I'm working on the back of this board with this technique. So I'm going to show you what I'm going to flip this, and hopefully my new square won't. Well, I don't care if it runs. So I'm going to flip this over, and on the back, I have used, working on this, I have used the saran wrap technique. And you can see where I've lifted the saran wrap, I have these white areas. And I'm now going back in and I'm using those as a guide, and I'm going around them. I'm just filling them in with these 2 colors. And it's almost like a little bit of a stained glass look to it. It's very cool. I haven't done it before. It's just an experiment, but I'm liking it. So I'm going to continue to work on that and see what happens. But that's something fun that you can do with your saran wrap. Make a bigger painting with it. All right, so we have all our techniques. I'm going to put this aside. And I'm going to show you the painting that I made and that you can make using all those different techniques. So I made a seascape. And this technique you'll recognize as the wash. And then I use the tissue paper, the tissue to pick up to make the clouds. Wet on wet with a lift. This is wet on dry, the ocean. The paper was dry. I used my paintbrush to create this sort of, I used the greens and the blues, sort of a Caribbean ocean. Here's my sand. I used my saran wrap to get the different textures in the sand. And then these rocks, what I used was what we just did. I used the drop in paint technique. I drew the rocks, kept dropping in paint, and then I splattered. So this painting, this little seascape, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 techniques to make this painting. So I hope that this has been informative for you. I hope that you've learned some very basic watercolor skills that you can then use to make a painting like this. And when we get together on August 11th, we can paint this together. And I can answer any questions and help you along the way if you need that. And we'll just paint together. So thanks so much for watching this pre-video. And I will see you on August 11th, and we'll paint together. All right, thanks so much. See you later. Bye.